The afternoon session was about trends, and I'm going to address it from a slightly particular and perhaps colorful angle. So, imagine that you're sailing along. You're sure of your course and your tack. You're avoiding the dangers of rocks and of the turning tides that any such voyage would present. But then a song, a mesmerizing, hypnotizing song of the promise of beauty and riches and bliss, makes you consider another route, and it leads you astray. Well, that's really the allegorical danger of all such important voyages. In this one, Ulysses, Jason faced the same harpies, the same sirens. And I would posit to you that trends can be like sirens. Trends can be very good. They can be feedback loops for positive events in the past. But by following trends, you really have to slow down and ask yourself, who's really in control here? And when it comes to sustainability and investing in sustainability, and likewise crafting policy around it, I think it's even more important to understand that we're at risk of going on the rocks. So the real question is, and I think it's consistent with a theme that we've heard today, is how can our modern day green Argonauts make the same journey and become heroes? The answer, of course, is lemons. A 3-hour drive from here, east, into Sweden, is perhaps the most talked about restaurant in the world today. If you didn't know that, please go. It's become synonymous with the new Nordic cuisine movement, led by such luminaries as René Redzepi of Denmark's Noma, or Mattias Dahlgren of Stockholm's eponymous restaurant, and other such star chefs. This past Sunday, in The Guardian, Alan Jenkins asked of Magnus Nilsson, the star chef of the restaurant Fäviken, of course, which I'm talking about, how he accounts for his rather meteoric rise. What's the secret? And actually he says, was there a eureka moment? You know, everyone always wants to have something summed up. What's the secret? What's the secret in your ketchup? To which Nilsson responds, maybe when I understood the most important thing, how good it is for your creativity to have some boundaries, some limitations. If you have everything to hand, at least for me, there's no reason to develop. If you want acidity, you just squeeze a lemon. But if you don't have a lemon, you need something else. My point is that very often, and quite mistakenly, people believe that constraints or limits are only holding you back. They're infringing upon your God-given right to freedom and liberty. And I think it's quite the opposite. And it's rather, as an American, I find it actually to be rather horrendous that we who are raised with this sort of political religion that, you first had the Constitution, then you had Moses, and then you had everything else, it misses the point. I mean, if you're so ready to adopt the notion that you must live by rules, how can you at the same time have a reflexive sort of allergic reaction to the notion that perhaps there's some constraints not even formed by humankind that we must live within? Here is just a representation. Please don't get caught in the spider web. It's really just one of many things out there that you could use as a tool when you go home and decide that you can't sleep and you want to go on the internet. Of course, I'm talking about planetary boundaries. And for anyone here who studied physics, given that I'm in Scandinavia, I think they teach you physics at 3 years old, followed by chemistry. Folks are very well educated, as well as unusually good looking. It's a very strange place for an American to spend time, to be honest. But anyway, I digress somewhat. How can we unlock our creative potential in ways that are beneficial both socially, ecologically, and economically? Well, by defining useful system boundaries that, rather than being constraints or things that impinge upon our ability to add value, actually structure our worldview in the most useful of ways. When it comes to sustainability, one of the nightmares that I live as a recovering consultant, I guess you could say, is watching, particularly at the outset of the investment bubble, movement, trend, watching people allocate capital in completely stupid ways. In America, we have the classic one, corn-based ethanol, right? Yeah, thank you. So does not pass the sniff test, my friends. If you take sustainability seriously and you have a framework where you realize that some things are here to stay, some things we really don't want to do. Okay? Corn-based ethanol is not one of them. And why is that? Well, you can look on the list, but it's everything from the energy intensity from fossil fuel-driven agricultural practices, the unsustainability of the monoculture underlying those agricultural practices, the loss of topsoil, the water intensity, oh yes, the resulting energy balance, which becomes negative, the fact that actually you start competing for food crops, which our neighbors in Mexico don't appreciate so much, because guess what? They don't have as much money to waste on such profligate things as SUVs that require more of their mice. The list goes on. And you see it happening time and again. You see it also, the specter raising its head and never really being addressed in constructive ways around, for example, nuclear energy. Yes, I put my foot in nuclear energy here in front of you. Nuclear energy is rather remarkable, and it's got a lot of amazing uses. But one thing that's never really talked about, given the specter of climate change, is the reality of radioactive isotopes that last longer than any civilization has ever lasted in the history of the world. And if you have some sort of insight as to what kind of insurance policy we today can devise to take care of 10,000-year half-lives, and, oh yeah, something called entropy, which is your friend and your enemy at the same time, I'm all ears. But that's never really factored into the conversation. And rather than saying nuclear is good or bad, we need to be able to make real comparisons. Another example, this is more of a policy one, and as a former investor in a Norwegian electric car company that ran on batteries, I'm very as much guilty and appreciative of this as anyone else. When we talk about success rates in recycling, which again you enjoy at stellar levels compared to the US, we have to make sure we understand if it has any value. Is it really that that good to say that we have a 90% recycling rate for our lead acid batteries? It sounds really good, right? I'll take 90% on anything, you know. One problem is 90% recycling means that in 10 years, it's as if you didn't recycle anything at all. And in a world such as the one I typically inhabit, which is Earth, where we have these laws of physics, nothing disappears, but everything spreads, you really got to think about, wait a second, what's the implication if we decide to move to a lead-acid-based battery infrastructure for the next 50 years? What does that mean for lead contamination? Or for any other heavy metal containing product, cadmium, for example, cadmium telluride, silicon cells. Let alone, of course, the issue of scarcity. Can we really have a fuel cell future if we're using platinum and everything's supposed to have a fuel cell? But hell, for that matter, can we really have a world where our automobile companies simply say it's more growth as usual? Because I'm not so sure Bangkok, Thailand has that much more road space for cars. And I could sound like kind of a doom and gloom person when I say that, but the funny thing is when I say what I've just told you, I get really excited because I feel like I'm on the inside track for understanding more appropriate business models. As I've said before, if I were running a car company or an automotive company or Statoil or whatever, that was for you, Telef, wherever you are, I would think, hey, look, the future is unknown, but we do know that we have constraints. We do know that we have limited resources. We do know that we have limited space. We have more and more people. Why don't we become smart in the things that will serve those markets best? Perhaps that means electrification of locomotion. What does that mean? Well, control systems, regenerative braking, various kinds of battery technologies, transmission technologies. And that's really great. Why? Because for battery cars or electric cars or plug-in hybrids, much of that know-how has a home. But it's equally at home and profitable in trains, in buses, and then other forms of an infrastructure for a world of 7 billion people and counting. If you want a list of useful such frameworks, you can go to the SVID, the Swedish Industrial Design website. I think it's svid.se, and they have a fairly good list of some of the better ones. So help you understand what I'm referring to. But without such constraints, you become a slave to mediocrity and chaos. You'll forever be buffeted, I would say, by the fickle winds of trends. Oops, going forward. It's not an orange, in case you're wondering. It's like that Heinz guy, he really likes his citrus. We really thought it would have been tomatoes, but no. Anyway, now, you hear a lot of these kinds of conferences about energy problems. And I'm here to say the unmentionable. We don't actually have an energy problem. In fact, cold fusion's been solved, in one way of speaking. This is the sun. It's actually the free fusion reactor in the sky, which, it should be noted, was, didn't cost anything, and sits at a safe distance from the Earth, which is rather important when talking about fusion. But also, as importantly, it delivers about 10,000 times the amount of energy that we as an industrial society use on a daily basis. 10,000 times. So we have some room to grow and to use it. And similar things can be said for other accessible forms of energy: wind, wave, tidal, geothermal. The real issue is, if we have all this available potential, are there ways to smartly access it? Because we are actually accessing it through oil and coal, just in a battery format. And again, when you begin to understand how to structure your thinking around sustainability through using a science-based approach to defining the nature of the problem, you understand that the problem is inherently material. The problem is really not one of energy. It's where we're getting our energy, and then it's what we're doing with our energy. So are we taking out things like carbon, uranium, heavy metals, and putting it into nature at a rate faster than nature is able to just put it back down? The answer is, for those of you who've watched anything with David Attenborough, yes, of course. And the same logic holds true for chemicals. I don't know if this is actually kind of fun if you watch a lot of science programs. The definition of toxicity, what is that? You all know? It's interactive audience participation. Just raise a hand. Anyone toxicity? I won't call on you, I promise. All right, I'll make up a hand, just like The Economist did with Adam Smith. Yeah, I would say, so toxicity is basically too much of anything is bad for you. And it sounds like an adage, a saying, but it's actually quite true, that everything has an ecotoxic threshold. It's a question of concentration. And for one substance, you can have different kinds of ecotoxic thresholds. That's what the big to-do is about carbon. I mean, we can't live without carbon. Why? Our plants need it. And then we need to eat the plants. And then it runs our combustion process, and we live, and everyone's happy, and we have a little symbiotic dance. But when it gets too much, things begin to change. And just to put in perspective, it's not just climate change, folks. It's ocean acidification. You get acidification due to carbon dioxide going into the oceans, killing coral reefs, disturbing life cycles there. So that's another example of one thing for which we are wholly dependent for life can have ecotoxic thresholds when the balance is knocked out. The same logic holds for any substance. Back to my point about we have a materials problem. So, a great example of things like, freons. Freons are fantastic. They're stable. They're non-toxic. Right. They're non-toxic because they don't make us sick when we drink a glass of it. However, they're persistent. And that means, per definition, what? If we release it into the environment, concentrations will increase. And concentration is the amount relative to the background levels. So 1 kilogram of iron, yarn, has a much higher concentration than 1 kilogram of quicksilver, mercury. Why? Because iron is everywhere. Mercury is not. So that gives you, if you've never studied science, you don't need to be a genius or a Nobel Prize winner to understand that. And that means, as a business leader or an investor, you can ask this simple question. If I invest in this technology, and we put more and more money in this, and then society begins to depend on it, and it becomes the new gold standard, will we be contributing to this problem or not? Because since nothing disappears and everything spreads, will we be increasing concentrations of these materials, concentrations, or not? These are the kinds of frameworks with which you can begin to make smart, I think, clean tech decisions. Speak of trendy, I know. So what's the next big thing in clean tech and energy and green technology? What's the next big thing tomorrow? Well, I'll start out by saying, first of all, no one knows, right? At which point you should boot me off the stage, I suppose. But 1 year ago, I was at a similar conference. It was smaller, and it was only CleanTech investors in Silicon Valley. And a very well-known venture capitalist made the following salient point in response to the question, will CleanTech have its Netscape moment? Now, I don't know how many of you are obsessed with like .com history, but the big the big hoorah, the big party began with the IPO of Netscape, which was the predecessor, I guess, to Microsoft's, anyway, early web browser. And it was that big IPO, a little bit maybe like REC in Norway, got people excited around the world in doing solar. That IPO started the big, what was at first seen as a bubble, but then became a long-term investment trend. And most of the people in the room said, nah, it was too expensive. I mean, you heard some very appropriate points from Thomas earlier this morning about how certain areas in CleanTech are not appropriate for venture capitalists, right? But no one told them that 4 years ago. So some people got burned. And so a lot of the people in the room said, no, it's too expensive. But this fellow said, let me remind you that 5 years ago when we started our fund, we couldn't fill the conference room, and it was a very small conference room, with specialists in CleanTech. Everyone else was a repurposed generalist scientist or repurposed from some other field. So if it was solar energy, it was an electrician. If it was fuel cells, it was some agronomist. Or biofuels, it was some agronomist. It was a chemist doing fuel cells. It was an engineer doing, say, combined heat and power. And it's really relevant because it's only now that the PhDs and the postdocs are coming out of universities who've had the benefit of hindsight, who've had the benefit of education focused on specific questions. So in part, we're only really seeing, I would say, the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's possible, just like they did. Okay? Just remember what happened. I mean, we had this bubble back in 2000. It deflated. Okay? And then you had a whole class of people coming out of school, specialized in computer science and infrastructure to support it. I posit that things will change. But let me spend 2 minutes talking about the kinds of technologies that I'm seeing that get me excited. One is thin film crystalline silicon. One reason that solceller, like you might call, have been so expensive is because it's actually a fairly heavy industrial process. But there are a couple of companies out there today, one of which is invested in by a local Norwegian fellow, that are doing away with the expensive parts of the industrial value chain and moving into the microchip or thin film world of what we call epitaxial growth. That's basically putting gas into it. Let me change the words there. That's putting gas into a box and growing perfect crystals and popping them off, which is where the secret is, and being able to produce solar at an estimated 50 US cents a watt. And the crazy thing is, if I had told you this 2 years ago, you would have said, wow, what a big difference between what the price of solar is today. But even with the heavy industrials, look at the price of solar today. So the world is changing fast. And the exciting thing is that we've seen, when you look at the cost basis and the efficiency gains of the new technologies, it's going to get a lot better on a technological basis really soon. Another technology space, which is, by the way, full disclosure, I'm invested in solar and these kinds of technologies, so I'm biased. Lignocellulosic biomass to sugars. It's a biofuels idea. What people really care about in the industrial world are things like sugar. And it's not Coca-Cola and Pepsi, though they care about that too, unfortunately. Even some condiment companies. No, it's chemical companies and fuel companies that can turn sugar into advanced biofuels, into green plastics and green chemistries. Believe it or not, something as mundane as sugar is of huge importance. But if you take sustainability seriously, you have to look, can the planet really provide habitat for its animals, including us, food for its animals, including us, and sugar for Happy Meal dolls? Well, the answer is that it can really help give us more options by using non-food crops that are weeds, for example, hemp or prairie grass. In fact, some things which can be integrated into an agricultural system in a useful way to produce materials of tomorrow. I mentioned combined heat and power earlier. Some of the work in advanced micro combined heat and power is quite exciting, allowing you to get next to 100% thermodynamic efficiencies by capturing waste heat plus electricity. And then the last technology area where we never talk about at these conferences, because we're always talking about energy, is advanced materials. There's some really, carbon nanotubes you've all heard about, I'm sure. And they're pretty cool because you can kind of do everything with them. You can do construction materials, like we heard today, for in certain applications for glues and binders. They make excellent conductors. And then in the process of exploring nanophysics, you open up a whole new avenue for development and understanding how physics completely changes and your whole world's turned upside down and new things are possible all over again. And also click catalysis. I don't know if you know about organic catalysis. Scandinavia actually has some really good ones. These are chemists who understand that you can use things like paper chemistry or polysaccharides, wood chemistry, and use enzymes to attach functional chemical groups to them. So basically you can get paper to act as you want, and then when you want to recycle the paper, you take out the chemical that you put in to give it color or to give it flame retardancy. You put another little enzyme in which keeps the paper regenerating, and you kind of have this nice closed loop, and it's really clean and exciting. Next slide. But it's not all happy days. So I mean, look, competing with this can't be that hard, okay? Especially in a world of 7 billion people and counting, as I've said earlier. In a world of diminishing natural resources and living systems in absolute terms. Less clean air, less clean atmosphere, less clean water, less living oceans, less soil fertility, less topsoil. I mean, that is a funnel we're heading into, which has real-world economic and political implications. You know, market failures are a funny thing. I mean, you never get this on Fox News anyway. They seem never to exist until there's an excuse that's needed. I mean, just ask any CDO trader on Wall Street. I mean, before 2008, these were like, the gods of the universe. Hey, well, you know what we're doing? We're making lots of money, and I'm wearing a white collar and a red tie and a blue shirt. Whatever. You couldn't argue with these guys. After 2008, well, we should have seen it coming, of course. There's a lot of theses being written. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to the environment, there's a long history of these tragic consequences of externalities. And again, if you don't recognize this as a risk manager at a fund, whether it's venture capital or a pension fund, you really aren't doing your job, because these are real risks. So, well, at least in my home country, somehow in certain circles it's become vogue, such as in our Congress, to insist that government really has no role to play in governance. And that in fact it's a paranoid, schizophrenically described invisible hand that's the only competent artistic hand to guide society. I'm sure it's not like this in Norway, right? No, okay. Actually, my experience from Sweden anyway is that you guys really are on a different planet. That's perhaps why I tend to live there part of the time. It is of course completely nuts. In 1338, in the town hall in Siena, the Lorenzetti was commissioned to paint the allegory of good and bad government. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I'm sure that the relevance of the fact that it's in town hall is not lost on you. So the government has, in one painting, this one is the effects of good government, showing that in fact the town's functioning, people are dancing in the street. It's kind of like any public art or public works project you get. The architect always submits something that works really nicely. But on the other wall is what happens when there's bad governance. You have crime, poverty, and degradation in the city core, and hunger. They've known this for a long time. Just ask any Roman emperor or anyone who's had to deal with food riots. Oh no, wait, they're all dead. Okay, well, case in point. But collective decision-making can, in fact, make a positive difference. And I'd like to give a shout-out to our friends in Germany. So, for 10 years, 81 million people, the German population, which is only 0.012% of world population. Please don't fact-check that. I remember having a zero in the wrong place at one slide, and I fixed it later. But anyway, the point is, It's a small percentage. That's 39%. Okay, for a decade, they had a feed-in tariff. You know, wonderfully German, very Teutonic, organized, smart. It reduces over time related to price of PV and all that. And as a result, for a decade, on average, they've represented 39% of the global market for PV, while the price in PV dropped 162%. So basically what I'm saying is a small country with means can do a lot. Norway is a smaller country with larger means, for example. So I think one of the fun exercises for you is wondering, I wonder what we can do. I think a lot more than you've ever imagined, to some of the points we heard earlier today. This is the penultimate slide. All that glitters is not gold. Okay. So in this world of rapidly changing technologies, opportunities, a lot of demands placed on you to deliver the gold, to bring back the money, bring home the bacon, just beware that while a trend may represent really wonderful success stories, whose times maybe are still there to invest in, or maybe those times have come and passed, they may also represent a mad rush, kind of a Pamplona moment into in the wrong direction. But I think that we know enough now, in fact we've known for a little while, of what the science is to bring that into our toolkits to become really smart decision makers and designers for a world that we can leave our children and not be ashamed by. Thanks very much.